November 3, 1943. The bridge of the cargo vessel Taiko Maru rolled gently in the South China Sea swells as Captain Hideaki Tanaka watched the sun sink toward the western horizon. His ship, laden with 12,000 tons of bauxite ore from the East Indies, was 3 days into what should have been a routine convoy run to Yokohama. The war was going badly, everyone knew that, but merchant shipping remained relatively safe. Also, Tanaka had been assured by the Naval General Staff officers who'd briefed convoy commanders in Singapore. American submarines were a nuisance, certainly, but Japanese destroyer escorts would keep them at bay. The Imperial Navy, masters of torpedo warfare since Port Arthur, understood submarine combat better than any navy on Earth. That confidence was about to be shattered by a periscope observation made from 1,800 yards away. Through the eyepiece of USS Wahoo's attack periscope, Commander Dudley Mush, Morton watched Taiko Maru steam along in the convoy's middle column, completely unaware that she had perhaps 10 minutes left to exist. Morton had been tracking this convoy for 6 hours, maneuvering his submarine into attack position with a patience that Japanese anti-submarine doctrine had never anticipated. The 4 destroyer escorts screening the convoy were following patterns Morton had studied in previous patrols: predictable zigzags timed to clock precision, search sectors that left exploitable gaps, sonar operators who pinged actively but rarely listened passively. The Japanese had built their entire anti-submarine warfare doctrine around protecting battleships and carriers. Merchant ships were an afterthought. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Morton gave the order to fire. 4 torpedoes left Wahoo's tubes in precisely timed sequence, their Mark 14 warheads carrying 670 pounds of Torpex explosive each. The weapons ran hot, straight, and normal, a phrase that would become darkly ironic given the Mark 14's notorious reliability problems earlier in the war. But by November 1943, those problems had been largely solved. American torpedoes now worked, and Japanese merchant ships were about to discover what that meant. Captain Tanaka never saw the torpedo wakes. The first explosion struck Taiko Maru just forward of the bridge, the warhead detonating against the hull plating with enough force to lift the bow clear of the water. The second torpedo hit amidships, rupturing fuel bunkers and flooding the engine room in seconds. The third and fourth were unnecessary. Taiko Maru was already dying, but they struck anyway, accelerating her descent. From bridge to seafloor took 7 minutes. Tanaka and 42 of his crew went down with her. 12,000 tons of bauxite ore, critical for aircraft production, settled onto the bottom of the South China Sea where it remains today. The destroyer escorts counterattacked with depth charges, dropping patterns that churned the water into foam and accomplished nothing. Wahoo had already slipped away, diving deep and running silent, exploiting thermal layers and ocean floor topology that Japanese sonar could barely detect. By sunset, Morton was studying recognition manuals, selecting his next target from the convoy's surviving ships. Over the next 48 hours, Wahoo would sink 3 more merchantmen before escaping into the Pacific's vast emptiness. This wasn't exceptional. This was routine. Between December 1941 and August 1945, United States submarines would sink 1,214 Japanese merchant vessels, totaling 5,300,000 tons. That represented 55% of all Japanese merchant shipping lost during the war, not to aircraft, not to mines, not to surface action, but to submarines, operating under a doctrine the Imperial Japanese Navy had catastrophically failed to counter. The mathematics of Japan's defeat were being written not in carrier battles or island invasions, but in the systematic destruction of the merchant fleet that carried the raw materials, fuel, and food that sustained the Japanese war machine. The revelation that would eventually dawn on Japanese naval officers came too late and proved too devastating to reverse. They had prepared to fight the wrong war with the wrong priorities, and their merchant marine, the circulatory system of their empire, had bled out while they watched. The origins of this disaster reached back to the 1920s, when the Imperial Japanese Navy developed its decisive battle doctrine. This strategy, refined at the Naval War College in Tokyo and enshrined in tactical manuals, centered on a single concept: the great battleship engagement that would destroy the American Pacific Fleet in one apocalyptic surface action. Every ship, every weapon, every tactical priority flowed from this central idea. Battleships were the queens of naval warfare. Cruisers and destroyers existed to screen them. Carriers provided reconnaissance and initial strikes. Submarines would ambush the enemy battle line, launching torpedo attacks that would weaken the Americans before the decisive engagement. Merchant shipping barely registered in this vision of naval warfare. Protection of sea lanes was considered a defensive auxiliary function, something to be handled by older destroyers, converted patrol craft, and minimal escorts. The cream of Japan's anti-submarine warfare capability, such as it was, remained tied to the combined fleet, guarding capital ships that spent most of the war swinging at anchor in places like Truk Lagoon and Kure Naval Base. Commander Toshihiko Omai, a staff officer at the Naval General Staff, understood the flaw in this thinking as early as 1942. His position gave him access to shipping loss reports that told an increasingly dire story. In a memorandum written in March 1942, just 3 months into the war, Omei warned his superiors that American submarines were already sinking merchants at a rate that would become unsustainable by 1943. His recommendation was stark: immediately prioritize anti-submarine warfare, construct hundreds of escort vessels, implement convoy systems modelled on British practice in the Atlantic, and reassign fleet destroyers to merchant protection. The memorandum was acknowledged and filed. No action was taken. The decisive battle remained the priority. Omei's warnings were rooted in brutal arithmetic. Japan's economy depended absolutely on imported raw materials. The home islands possessed almost no oil, limited iron ore, insufficient coal, and inadequate rice production to feed the population. The conquest of Southeast Asia and the East Indies had been undertaken specifically to secure these resources. But resources in Borneo, Malaya, and the Philippines were worthless if they couldn't reach Japanese factories. Every ton of oil, every pound of rubber, every bushel of rice had to cross ocean distances measured in thousands of miles, through waters where American submarines operated with increasing impunity. The shipping requirements were staggering. Japan's economy required approximately 10 million tons of imports annually just to maintain minimal industrial production and food supplies. This translated to hundreds of cargo voyages monthly, each representing a potential target for submarines that were growing more numerous and more capable with each passing month. At the start of the war, Japan possessed approximately 6 million tons of merchant shipping, barely adequate for peacetime needs, and wholly insufficient for wartime operations across a Pacific empire. Captain Atsushi Oi, who served as a convoy escort commander throughout the war and survived to write extensively about Japan's anti-submarine failure, later calculated that Japan needed to construct replacement tonnage at a rate of at least 800,000 tons annually, just to compensate for normal attrition and combat losses. Japanese shipyards, operating at maximum capacity, managed to produce roughly 700,000 tons in 1942. That figure would drop each subsequent year as raw materials grew scarce and American bombing intensified. The mathematics were unsustainable from the beginning. Every merchant sunk represented tonnage that couldn't be replaced quickly enough. The deficit compounded monthly, creating a death spiral of declining imports, reduced industrial output, and weakened defensive capabilities. But the Naval General Staff remained fixated on the decisive battle that never came. The United States submarine force that would exploit this Japanese negligence had itself emerged from catastrophic failure. In December 1941, American submarines entered combat with perhaps the most dysfunctional torpedo in modern naval history. The Mark 14 torpedo, the primary weapon of the submarine fleet, suffered from multiple fatal flaws. Its magnetic influence exploder detonated prematurely or not at all. Its contact exploder often failed on impact. The torpedoes ran 10 feet deeper than set, passing harmlessly beneath target ships. And even when everything functioned correctly, the Mark 14 often proved too slow to catch fast-moving warships. Submarine commanders filed report after report documenting these failures. Skippers watched perfect attacks result in dud torpedoes bouncing harmlessly off enemy hulls. The frustration was matched by fury as submarine crews risked their lives executing textbook attacks only to have their weapons fail. Some commanders, like Dudley Morton and Richard O'Kane, began modifying their torpedoes in the field, deactivating the magnetic exploders and adjusting depth settings based on empirical observation rather than Bureau of Ordnance specifications. The torpedo crisis wasn't fully resolved until mid-1943, when the Bureau of Ordnance finally admitted the problems and implemented corrections. But those 18 months of torpedo failures had one unintended consequence that would prove devastating for Japanese merchant shipping. American submarine commanders learned to close to point-blank range before firing to maximize hit probability despite faulty weapons. This aggressive doctrine, born of necessity, became ingrained in submarine tactics. Even after the torpedoes were fixed, American submarines continued pressing attacks at ranges that Japanese anti-submarine forces found incomprehensible. Japanese destroyer captains had been taught that submarines would fire from 3,000 to 5,000 yards ranges, where sonar detection and depth charge counterattacks would be effective. American submarines regularly attacked from under 1,000 yards, sometimes as close as 500 yards. At those ranges, by the time sonar detected the submarine, torpedoes were already in the water and counterattack was futile. Commander Haruki Yamamoto, captain of destroyer Yamagumo, experienced this reality during a convoy escort mission in March 1943. His after-action report, recovered from Japanese naval archives, documented his bewilderment at American tactics. The submarine's periscope was sighted at less than 800 yards from the convoy. Before depth charges could be prepared, 4 torpedoes struck 2 merchantmen. The submarine had closed to point-blank range without our sonar detecting its approach. It attacked from inside our defensive perimeter. This is contrary to all submarine doctrine as we understand it. What Yamamoto didn't understand was that American submarine doctrine had been forged in the fires of failed weapons. The Mark 14 crisis had taught submarine commanders that only close-range attacks guaranteed hits. That lesson, learned at terrible cost, created the most aggressive submarine force in naval history, one that treated merchant convoys not as dangerous opponents to be attacked cautiously, but as target-rich environments to be penetrated and exploited. The technological advantages American submarines possessed would have shocked Japanese naval planners if they'd fully grasped them. A fleet boat like USS Tang or USS Silversides displaced 1,500 tons surfaced, carried 24 torpedoes, and could make 20 knots on the surface using 4 diesel engines. Submerged, electric motors drove the boat at 9 knots for limited periods. The pressure hull was designed to operate at 300 feet, though many commanders took their boats deeper when under attack. Range exceeded 11,000 miles at 10 knots. Allowing patrols lasting 60 days or more. But specifications alone didn't explain American submarine effectiveness. The real advantages lay in less obvious areas. American submarines possessed the torpedo data computer, a mechanical analog computer that calculated firing solutions automatically, accounting for target speed, angle, range, and torpedo characteristics. This device allowed submarines to engage multiple targets simultaneously and conduct attacks in conditions where manual calculations would have been impossible. Japanese submarines possessed no equivalent technology. Their attacks required manual calculations that consumed precious time and limited engagement flexibility. The radar systems installed on American submarines by 1943 provided another decisive edge. The SJ surface search radar could detect ships at ranges exceeding 10 miles in good conditions, allowing submarines to track convoys at night or in poor visibility without exposing their periscopes. Japanese merchant ships and many escorts lacked radar entirely. They were blind to submarine approaches until lookouts spotted periscope wakes or torpedo tracks, usually far too late. American submarine communications capabilities enabled coordinated attacks that Japanese anti-submarine forces couldn't counter. Submarines equipped with high-frequency radio could share contact reports with other boats in the patrol area, setting up wolf pack attacks where multiple submarines would assault a single convoy from different directions simultaneously. The Japanese had copied German wolf pack tactics for their own submarines, but never developed effective defenses against American implementation of the same concept. Lieutenant Commander Shigetoshi Mochizuki, intelligence officer aboard cruiser Maya, monitored American submarine radio traffic throughout 1943 and 1944. His decryption unit couldn't break American codes, but signal analysis revealed the coordination level American submarines achieved. His report to Combined Fleet Headquarters in August 1944 contained a stark warning. Enemy submarines communicate freely during attacks, coordinating their movements against our convoys. They operate as packs, not individual hunters. Our escort forces are trained to counter single submarines. We have no doctrine for defeating coordinated submarine attacks. The warning came too late to develop countermeasures. By August 1944, Japan's merchant fleet was already in terminal decline. The first systematic evidence of catastrophic merchant losses reached Admiral Osami Nagano, Chief of the Naval General Staff, in April 1943. The report, compiled by Captain Atsushi Oi's Convoy Escort Section, documented losses that should have triggered immediate strategic reassessment. In the first 16 months of war, American submarines had sunk 387 Japanese merchant vessels, totaling 1,500,000 tons. The replacement rate from Japanese shipyards was running at barely half the loss rate. More ominously, the trend line showed losses accelerating, not stabilizing. Nagano read the report during a staff conference at Naval General Staff Headquarters in Tokyo. His response, recorded in the meeting minutes, revealed the conceptual blindness that would doom Japan's merchant fleet. Submarine warfare is a secondary concern. Our priority remains the decisive engagement with the American carrier fleet. Once we achieve victory in that battle, the submarine threat will become manageable as we control the sea lanes through surface supremacy. The decisive battle Nagano envisioned would never occur, but the submarines would continue their work every single day. The convoy system Japan finally implemented in late 1943 came too late and was executed with fatal compromises. British practice in the Atlantic had demonstrated that convoy protection required overwhelming escort strength, at least 6 dedicated anti-submarine vessels per convoy, preferably more, with air cover provided by long-range patrol aircraft or escort carriers. The British had learned through terrible losses in 1940 through 1942 that anything less invited disaster. Japan attempted to run convoys with 2 or 3 escorts per dozen merchant ships, sometimes fewer. The destroyers assigned to escort duty were often older vessels or new construction with minimal anti-submarine capability. Many lacked modern sonar. Depth charge capacity was inadequate. Japanese destroyers typically carried 36 depth charges compared to over 100 on American destroyer escorts. Worse, the tactical doctrine for escort commanders emphasized aggressive counterattacks against detected submarines rather than maintaining close proximity to the merchant ships they were supposed to protect. Commander Tamechi Hara, one of Japan's most accomplished destroyer captains, described the frustration of convoy escort duty in his post-war memoir. He'd been assigned to escort operations in late 1943, after distinguishing himself in surface actions earlier in the war. What he encountered shocked him. We were expected to protect 15 or 20 merchants with 2 destroyers. When a submarine attacked, doctrine required us to pursue and destroy it, which meant leaving the convoy unprotected. By the time we returned from fruitless depth charge attacks, another merchant was sinking. We were not protecting convoys. We were witnessing their destruction while following orders that made no tactical sense. The absence of air cover for most convoy routes created a vulnerability that American submarines exploited ruthlessly. Japanese patrol aircraft lacked the range to cover the critical sea lanes between the East Indies and Japan. The routes passed through vast ocean expanses, where convoys steamed for days without any air protection. American submarines would surface at night to recharge batteries and pace the convoys, waiting for optimal attack positions. When escorts detected them and forced them under, the submarines simply waited until the escorts moved away, then surfaced again and resumed tracking. Lieutenant Commander Eugene Fluckey, commanding USS Barb, described this tactical pattern in his patrol reports from 1944. Japanese escorts follow predictable patterns. They race toward our last known position when we dive, drop depth charges in the wrong location, then return to the convoy. We surface behind them and resume tracking. Without air cover, they can't keep us down. Without sufficient escorts, they can't screen all approaches. We choose when and where to attack. They react. The initiative is entirely ours. The specific vulnerabilities of Japanese merchant ship design compounded the submarine threat. Most Japanese cargo vessels were built to peacetime commercial standards with minimal watertight subdivision. A single torpedo hit amidships would often doom the vessel by flooding multiple compartments simultaneously. Damage control capabilities were primitive compared to American or British standards. Crews lacked training in emergency procedures. Pumping equipment was inadequate. Many ships carried no rafts or insufficient lifeboats, meaning that sinking often resulted in heavy crew casualties. The Taiko Maru incident in June 1943 illustrated these vulnerabilities with tragic clarity. The 7,000-ton cargo ship was carrying ammunition and aviation fuel from Balikpapan to Yokohama when USS Harder intercepted her convoy south of Mindanao. Commander Samuel Dudley pressed his attack to 800 yards before firing a spread of 3 torpedoes. 2 struck Taiko Maru on the port side, 1 forward and 1 aft. The forward hit ruptured fuel bunkers, flooding the bow and causing the ship to settle rapidly by the head. The aft hit detonated near ammunition storage, triggering secondary explosions that blew out the stern. Taiko Maru broke in half 7 minutes after being hit. She carried 470 crew and passengers, including 200 Japanese Army troops being transferred to Philippines garrison duty. The escorts rescued 93 survivors. 377 men died, not from drowning, but from inadequate life-saving equipment and the catastrophic speed of the sinking. Captain Minoru Yokota, commanding one of the escort destroyers, filed a report that was notable for its bitter honesty. The merchant ship had no chance of survival. 2 torpedo hits caused structural failure that no damage control could address. The crew abandoned ship, but most had no life preservers. The rafts were insufficient for the number aboard. We recovered those we could find, but the ship sank so quickly that most were trapped below or thrown into the water without flotation equipment. This was not combat. This was a death sentence for men sailing in ships never designed to survive torpedo attack. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The human cost of Japan's merchant marine losses has never been fully calculated, but post-war research suggests it was staggering. Estimates place Japanese merchant seamen killed during the war at approximately 60,000 men, a casualty rate higher than any branch of the Japanese military, except perhaps the Army Air Force. These were not combat troops trained for death in battle, but civilian sailors pressed into military service, manning ships they knew were sailing toward probable destruction. The psychology of serving on Japanese merchant ships deteriorated throughout 1943 and 1944 as losses mounted. Seamen watched convoy mates sink voyage after voyage. They knew that American submarines were hunting them, that escort protection was inadequate, and that survival odds decreased with each trip. Morale collapsed. Desertion increased despite harsh penalties. Some men would wound themselves deliberately to avoid sailing. Others simply disappeared before scheduled departures, vanishing into the chaos of wartime Japan, where tracking individual civilians became impossible. Chief Engineer Saburo Sakai served on 6 different merchant ships during the war, surviving 3 sinkings. His diary, published posthumously, captured the mounting dread. Each voyage feels like a death sentence delayed. We steam into the South China Sea, knowing submarines are watching. Every underwater sound might be a torpedo. Every surface ripple might be a periscope. Sleep is impossible. Food tastes like ash. We are dead men awaiting confirmation. Some pray, some drink. Most simply endure, because refusal means execution for cowardice. The Americans kill our ships. Our own navy kills anyone who refuses to sail on them. The operational impact of merchant losses began cascading through Japan's war economy by late 1943. The most critical shortage was of oil. Japan had conquered the Dutch East Indies specifically to secure petroleum resources for the military and industry. The oil fields at Tarakan, Balikpapan, and Palembang produced high-quality crude that Japanese refineries converted into aviation, gasoline, diesel fuel, and bunker oil. But that oil had to be transported to Japan in tankers that became priority targets for American submarines. Tanker construction had never been a priority for Japanese shipyards. At the start of the war, Japan possessed approximately 49 modern tankers, with a combined capacity of roughly 580,000 tons. That was barely sufficient for peacetime petroleum imports, completely inadequate for wartime military consumption. The Naval General Staff had calculated that fleet operations alone required minimum tanker capacity of 800,000 tons to maintain fuel supplies to forward bases and operational units. American submarines specifically targeted tankers whenever possible. The destruction of a tanker represented not just a ship sunk but weeks or months of irreplaceable petroleum supplies lost. The psychological impact on crews made tanker duty a form of punishment detail. Tankers were floating bombs. A single torpedo hit could create fuel fires that incinerated entire crews before they could abandon ship. The burn death rate on tankers exceeded 70% compared to perhaps 30% on regular cargo vessels. Between January 1943 and December 1944, American submarines sank 153 Japanese tankers totaling over 600,000 tons. That represented more than the entire pre-war tanker fleet destroyed in 2 years. Replacement construction managed perhaps 20 tankers annually. The mathematics meant that by early 1945, Japan's tanker capacity had been reduced to approximately 170,000 tons, less than one-third the minimum required to sustain military operations. The fuel crisis manifested in ways that crippled Japan's ability to wage war. By mid-1944, the combined fleet was forced to base its major surface units near oil sources in Southeast Asia because insufficient tanker capacity existed to transport fuel to Japanese home waters. The battleships Yamato and Musashi, the most powerful warships ever built, spent most of the war swinging at anchor near Singapore and Borneo specifically, because moving them consumed fuel that couldn't be replaced. When they finally sortied for battle, Musashi at Leyte Gulf in October 1944, Yamato for Operation Tengo in April 1945, both sailed, knowing they had insufficient fuel for return voyages. The aviation fuel shortage proved even more decisive. Pilot training programs were cut drastically because flight hours burned fuel that didn't exist. New pilots reached operational units with fewer than 100 flight hours, sometimes as few as 50, compared to 300 or more for American pilots. The skill differential this created showed immediately in combat. Inexperienced Japanese pilots were slaughtered by veteran American fighter pilots who'd received unlimited fuel for training. The mythology of Japanese pilot superiority, earned through extensive pre-war training, collapsed under the weight of fuel scarcity that made proper training impossible. Captain Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the Pearl Harbor attack and survived to serve in staff positions, watched the pilot quality decline with horror. In a 1944 report to Combined Fleet Headquarters, he wrote with unusual bluntness, "Our new pilots are dying in their first combats because they lack basic flight proficiency. They lack proficiency because we cannot provide fuel for adequate training. We cannot provide fuel because submarines have destroyed our tanker fleet. The Americans are defeating us not with superior pilots, but by denying us the petroleum to create pilots. This is strategic warfare we have no counter for." The food situation was equally dire. Japan's agriculture could not feed its population without imports. Rice from Korea, Taiwan, and Southeast Asia supplied perhaps 30% of domestic consumption. Fish protein supplemented rice, but fishing fleets required fuel that grew increasingly scarce. By 1944, rice imports had dropped to half their pre-war levels. Rationing grew severe. Malnutrition increased. Industrial workers weakened from inadequate nutrition, reducing productivity in factories already struggling with raw material shortages. The merchant ships that should have carried food were being sunk or diverted to military supply runs deemed higher priority. The choice between feeding the population and supplying the military created no-win scenarios. Military supply took precedence because starving soldiers couldn't fight, but starving workers couldn't manufacture weapons. The entire war economy entered a death spiral, driven fundamentally by the inability to transport essential materials across submarine-infested waters. Major General Takeo Yasuda, responsible for Army logistics planning, compiled starvation statistics in early 1945 that shocked even hardened military planners. His report documented that Japanese soldiers in bypassed Pacific garrisons were dying from malnutrition at rates exceeding combat deaths. On Bougainville, more than 5,000 Japanese troops died from starvation between January and August 1945. On Rabaul, the garrison of 90,000 men survived by converting the base into a massive farm, growing sweet potatoes to avoid mass starvation. These were combat soldiers, trained for war, reduced to subsistence farmers because merchant ships could no longer reliably deliver supplies. Yasuda's report concluded with devastating candor. We cannot sustain military operations across the Pacific when our transport capability has been destroyed. Soldiers garrison islands they cannot leave. Supplies stockpile in the home islands because we lack ships to deliver them. The Americans are not defeating us in battle. They are isolating us, allowing our own logistics failures to destroy our forces without combat. Every sunken merchant ship represents not just tonnage but human lives that will starve on some distant island. The submarine campaign's impact on raw materials proved equally catastrophic. Japan's industry required constant imports of iron ore, bauxite for aluminum production, tin, tungsten, rubber, and dozens of other materials. The conquests of 1941 and 42 had secured these resources, but securing them meant nothing if they couldn't reach Japanese factories. The bauxite situation illustrated the cascading failures. Japan possessed no domestic bauxite deposits. All aluminum production depended on bauxite imported from the East Indies and Malaya. Aluminum was essential for aircraft production. An average fighter required approximately 1 ton of aluminum, a bomber 3 to 4 tons. By 1944, aircraft production targets called for 28,000 planes annually. That required approximately 50,000 tons of aluminum, which required roughly 200,000 tons of bauxite, which required hundreds of cargo voyages across submarine-infested waters. The voyages never came. Bauxite imports collapsed from 1 million tons in 1943 to 300,000 tons in 1944 to virtually zero in 1945. Aluminum production fell correspondingly. Aircraft production targets were never met. The planes that were built often used substitute materials, wood replacing aluminum in non-critical structures, inferior alloys substituting for proper materials. Performance suffered. Maintenance became nightmarish. Airframes failed structurally in combat. Commander Masatake Okumiya, who served as an air operations staff officer, documented the material crisis in his post-war writings. We designed excellent aircraft but built them with inadequate materials because submarines denied us the resources we needed. The Zero fighter that dominated the early war became a death trap by 1944, not because American planes improved, though they did, but because our Zeros were built with inferior aluminum, rigged with substitute parts, maintained with improvised materials. We lost not because our designs failed, but because our supply chain collapsed. The convoy battles that raged throughout 1944 demonstrated both American submarine dominance and Japanese anti-submarine incompetence. The Take-Ichi convoy of November 1944 became a case study in systematic destruction. This convoy, designated Take-ichi using Japanese military terminology, consisted of 10 merchant ships carrying reinforcements and supplies to the Philippines garrison. The route from Shanghai to Manila covered approximately 1,500 miles, through waters where multiple American submarine patrol areas overlapped. 6 American submarines, Queenfish, Barb, Picuda, Seahorse, Pintado, and Atule, intercepted the convoy through coordinated attacks spanning 3 days. The submarines had received intelligence about the convoy's departure and timing, allowing them to position themselves along the projected route. When Take-ichi sailed on November 9th, it steamed directly into a gauntlet of submarines operating under unified command. The attacks began on November 11th when Queenfish penetrated the escort screen and sank 2 transports. The escorts counterattacked, driving Queenfish deep but failing to inflict damage. While the escorts pursued Queenfish, Barb attacked from the opposite side, sinking another transport and damaging a 4th. The convoy commander, overwhelmed by attacks from multiple directions, ordered an emergency turn that scattered the formation and made coordinated escort protection impossible. Over the next 36 hours, the remaining submarines methodically picked apart the convoy. Picuda sank 2 more ships on November 12th. Seahorse torpedoed the damaged transport and another merchantman on November 13th. By the time Take-ichi reached Manila on November 14th, only 4 of the original 10 merchants survived. 6 ships totaling 43,000 tons had been sent to the bottom. More than 4,000 Japanese soldiers and sailors died in the attacks. The critical supplies they'd been transporting, ammunition, food, medical equipment, were lost. The escort commander, Commander Shigenori Kami, filed an after-action report that remains one of the most brutally honest assessments of Japanese anti-submarine failure. We faced coordinated submarine attacks against which our doctrine provides no defense. The submarines communicated with each other, positioning themselves for sequential attacks that prevented effective counterattack. When we pursued one submarine, others attacked. Our sonar could not track multiple contacts simultaneously. Our depth charges could not reach the depths to which they dove. Our speed was insufficient to catch them on the surface. We escorted 10 ships into battle. We delivered 4 ships to Manila. This is not escort duty. This is presiding over a massacre. Commander Kami's report reached Naval General Staff Headquarters, where it joined hundreds of similar reports documenting convoy catastrophes. The pattern was unmistakable. American submarines were destroying Japan's merchant fleet faster than it could be replaced, and no tactical or technological solution existed within Japan's capabilities. The strategic implications were clear to any staff officer willing to face reality. Japan was being strangled, slowly but inexorably, by a submarine campaign against which it had no effective defense. Yet even in late 1944, with merchant losses approaching catastrophic levels, the Naval General Staff refused to shift priorities. Fleet operations remained paramount. The decisive battle doctrine persisted despite all evidence of its irrelevance. Destroyers that should have been protecting convoys continued screening capital ships that barely left port. Anti-submarine warfare remained a secondary concern right up until Japan's surrender. The human stories behind the statistics revealed the intimate horror of submarine warfare. Survivors of merchant sinkings described scenarios that haunted them for life. Ships would be struck without warning, torpedo explosions ripping through hull plating below the waterline. Engineering spaces would flood instantly, drowning men at their duty stations. Ammunition ships would detonate in secondary explosions that vaporized entire crews. Tankers would become infernos, burning men alive as flaming oil spread across the water. Those who made it off sinking ships faced their own nightmares. Life rafts were often inadequate or damaged in the explosions. Men would cling to debris in tropical waters, exposed to sun, dehydration, and sharks. Rescue was uncertain. Escort vessels might be engaged with submarines and unable to stop for survivors. Some men floated for days before dying of exposure. Others were simply never found, their deaths unrecorded except as names on crew lists of ships that never arrived. Seaman First Class Yoshio Nakamura survived 3 separate sinkings and spent a total of 11 days in the water before final rescue. His testimony, recorded by post-war researchers, captured the psychological destruction of repeated trauma. After the first sinking, I believed I was lucky to survive. After the second, I believed I was cursed to survive only to die next time. After the third, I believed I was already dead and simply hadn't stopped moving yet. I sailed again because orders required it, but I was not afraid anymore. Fear requires believing you might survive. I had stopped believing that. By January 1945, Japan's merchant fleet had been reduced to approximately 2 million tons, less than 1/3, its capacity at the start of the war. The sea lanes that had once connected the empire now functioned as submarine hunting grounds, where Japanese ships died with mechanical regularity. The statistics compiled by Naval General Staff logistics officers told a story of systematic annihilation that no amount of bureaucratic language could soften. In December 1944 alone, American submarines sank 173,000 tons of merchant shipping. That represented more tonnage than Japanese shipyards had constructed in the entire previous year. The oil situation had become terminal. Tanker capacity had been reduced to the point where sustaining even minimal petroleum imports from the East Indies was impossible. The Naval General Staff calculated that the fleet required 300,000 tons of fuel monthly for basic operations. Actual deliveries in January 1945 totaled 18,000 tons, 6% of requirements. The mathematics meant that major fleet operations were no longer feasible. The combined fleet had effectively become a non-operational force, its ships immobilized by fuel starvation. Admiral Soemu Toyoda, who'd assumed command of the combined fleet in May 1944, faced the reality that his battleships and carriers were strategic assets that couldn't be employed strategically. In a staff conference in February 1945, Toyoda acknowledged what his subordinates had known for months. We possess a fleet that cannot sail because we lack fuel to move it. We lack fuel because we lack tankers to transport it. We lack tankers because submarines have destroyed them. The Americans have defeated our fleet without engaging it in battle. This is a form of warfare our doctrine never anticipated. The desperation of Japan's shipping situation manifested in increasingly desperate measures. Submarines, precious assets designed for offensive operations, were converted to cargo carriers. Fleet submarines like the I-class boats would load their torpedo rooms with critical supplies and make high-speed runs to isolated garrisons. These missions achieved almost nothing strategically, while wasting assets that might have been employed against American shipping. But the alternative was abandoning hundreds of thousands of troops to starvation, and even in defeat, Japanese military culture couldn't accept that option. The submarine cargo runs illustrated how completely the strategic situation had inverted. Japan, which had envisioned submarine warfare as a tool to weaken the American battle fleet before the decisive engagement, now used submarines to ferry rice and ammunition to starving garrisons. The irony was lost on no one involved. Commander Zenji Orita, who commanded several of these supply runs, captured the absurdity in his post-war memoir. We had built submarines to hunt enemy capital ships. Instead, we used them to deliver food to men we'd already abandoned. Each supply run consumed fuel we couldn't replace and risked boats we couldn't afford to lose. But orders were orders, and Japanese soldiers were dying of hunger on islands we still claimed to defend. The American submarine force, meanwhile, had reached its operational apex. By early 1945, roughly 240 submarines were operational in the Pacific, organized into coordinated patrol groups that covered every major shipping lane between Japan and the Southern Territories. The submarines operated with near impunity. Japanese air cover was virtually non-existent due to fuel shortages and pilot losses. Escort forces had been depleted by attrition and redeployment to kamikaze screening duties. Sonar capabilities remained primitive compared to American sound gear. The hunter-killer groups that had proven so effective in the Atlantic never materialized in the Pacific because Japan lacked the industrial capacity and tactical doctrine to create them. Commander Richard O'Kane, whose USS Tang would become the most successful American submarine of the war before being lost to a circular running torpedo in October 1944, exemplified the aggressive doctrine that dominated American submarine operations. O'Kane's patrol reports documented attacks pressed to such close range that his boat was often rocked by the explosions of his own torpedoes. In one attack off Formosa in June 1944, Tang sank 5 ships from a convoy in a single night engagement, firing 24 torpedoes at ranges averaging less than 1,000 yards. O'Kane's success wasn't exceptional, it was representative. American submarine commanders had internalized the lessons of early war failures and developed tactics that exploited every Japanese weakness. They attacked at night when Japanese lookouts were least effective. They penetrated escort screens rather than attacking from outside them. They used radar to track convoys in conditions where Japanese forces were operating blind. They coordinated attacks through radio communication, creating situations where escort forces were overwhelmed by multiple threats simultaneously. The tonnage figures from 1944 documented the devastating effectiveness of these tactics. American submarines sank 603 merchant ships, totaling 2,700,000 tons more than Japan had lost in the previous 2.5 years combined. The acceleration of losses reflected both increased American submarine numbers and the collapse of Japanese defensive capabilities. Each sunken escort reduced protection for future convoys. Each dead sonar operator represented expertise that couldn't be replaced. Each destroyed depth charge meant one less weapon available to counter submarine attacks. The psychological impact on Japanese naval officers who understood the strategic situation was profound. These men had devoted their lives to naval warfare, studied at prestigious academies, absorbed doctrine that emphasized offensive action and decisive battle. Now they watched helplessly as American submarines strangled their empire through a campaign of attrition that their training had never prepared them to counter. The cognitive dissonance between what they'd been taught and what they were experiencing created a crisis of professional confidence. Captain Toshikazu Omai, whose early warnings about submarine warfare had been ignored, wrote a final memorandum to the Naval General Staff in March 1945. The document, discovered in post-war archives, remains one of the most devastating self-assessments ever produced by a Japanese officer during the war. We built a navy to fight battleship engagements. The Americans built a navy to destroy maritime commerce. We perfected tactics for surface warfare. They perfected tactics for undersea warfare. We concentrated our best ships and officers on fleet operations. They concentrated theirs on merchant interdiction. We believed control of the sea meant winning battles. They understood it meant controlling logistics. We fought the war we wanted to fight. They fought the war that achieved strategic objectives. Every sunken merchant ship, every ton of undelivered cargo, every starved garrison represents our failure to understand modern naval warfare. Omei's memorandum was acknowledged and filed, like his earlier warnings. But by March 1945, acknowledgement was meaningless. The merchant fleet was destroyed, the empire was isolated, the war was lost. The final months of the war saw Japanese shipping reduced to desperate coastal movements and nighttime runs that achieved almost nothing. Submarines prowled the waters around the home islands, sinking even small vessels that posed no military threat. The blockade was complete and pitiless. By August 1945, Japanese imports had fallen to less than 10% of pre-war levels. Starvation was endemic, industrial production had collapsed, the military forces that remained were immobilized by fuel shortages and isolated by transportation failures. The statistics of the submarine campaign against Japanese merchant shipping remain among the most lopsided in naval history. American submarines sank 1,214 Japanese merchant ships, totaling 5,300,000 tons. They destroyed 214 Japanese naval vessels, including 1 battleship, 8 aircraft carriers, and 11 cruisers. They accomplished this while losing 52 submarines to all causes, a kill ratio that no other submarine force in history has approached. The human cost was equally lopsided. Approximately 3,500 American submariners died during the war, the highest casualty rate of any American military branch at 22%. But Japanese merchant marine losses exceeded 60,000 men, 20 times the American submarine casualties. If Japanese naval personnel killed on warships sunk by submarines are included, total Japanese deaths from submarine action exceeded 100,000 men. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, later stated that American submarines had contributed more to Japan's defeat than any other single weapon system. His assessment, based on comprehensive post-war analysis, concluded that the submarine campaign had accomplished what battleships, carriers, and strategic bombing could never have achieved alone: the complete economic strangulation of an island empire dependent on maritime commerce. The Japanese officers who survived the war and reflected on the submarine campaign reached conclusions that were remarkably consistent. They had failed to anticipate the strategic importance of merchant shipping protection. They had allocated insufficient resources to anti-submarine warfare. They had persisted in doctrine that prioritized fleet battles over sea lane protection. They had underestimated American submarine capabilities and determination. Most fundamentally, they had failed to understand that modern war was industrial conflict where logistics mattered more than tactics. Vice Admiral Shigeyoshi Miwa, who'd commanded submarine operations for the Imperial Navy throughout the war, wrote extensively in the post-war years about Japan's strategic failures. His analysis, published in 1954, contained a passage that captured the essence of Japan's defeat. "We built submarines to attack warships. The Americans built submarines to attack cargo ships. We measured success in enemy capital ships sunk. They measured success in tonnage destroyed. We sought glory through battle. They sought victory through strangulation. Our submarines achieved tactical successes that contributed nothing to strategic objectives. Their submarines achieved strategic victory through systematic economic warfare. We fought as warriors. They fought as industrialists. In modern war, the industrialists always win." The doctrine that had doomed Japan's merchant fleet had its roots in cultural and institutional factors that extended far beyond simple tactical error. The Imperial Navy had emerged from the Meiji Restoration, shaped by British naval thinking that emphasized decisive battle and fleet-on-fleet action. The victory at Tsushima in 1905, where Admiral Togo's battleships had annihilated the Russian Baltic Fleet, became the template for all subsequent naval planning. Every officer studied Tsushima. Every tactical manual referenced it. The decisive battle became not just strategy but ideology, a belief system that shaped how Japanese naval officers understood their profession. But Tsushima had been fought in an era when maritime commerce protection was considered a secondary concern, when submarines were primitive curiosities, when naval warfare meant surface ships exchanging gunfire at visible ranges. The world had changed dramatically between 1905 and 1941, but Japanese naval doctrine had not. The institutional momentum of 40 years of decisive battle thinking proved impossible to overcome, even when evidence mounted that the doctrine was obsolete. The Americans, by contrast, had developed submarine warfare doctrines specifically for a Pacific war against Japan. War Plan Orange, developed throughout the 1920s and 30s, explicitly called for submarine campaigns against Japanese maritime commerce. American naval planners understood that Japan's dependence on imports created a strategic vulnerability that submarines could exploit. The doctrine was in place before Pearl Harbor. The submarines were building before the first shot was fired. The campaign against Japanese merchant shipping didn't emerge from improvisation or luck. It was the execution of a pre-war plan developed specifically to strangle Japan's economy. Lieutenant Commander Hanku Sasaki, a Japanese naval intelligence officer who'd spent years analyzing American naval capabilities before the war, recognized this reality too late to matter. His post-war testimony to American interrogators contained a striking admission. "We knew the Americans had developed War Plan Orange. We had copies of their planning documents obtained through intelligence operations. We read their scenario for submarine warfare against our commerce. We dismissed it as impossible because our doctrine said submarines should attack warships, not merchants. We saw their plan and refused to believe they would actually implement it because it contradicted our understanding of proper naval warfare. Our arrogance blinded us to reality. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe. The legacy of the submarine campaign extended far beyond World War II. The systematic destruction of Japan's merchant fleet became a case study in modern naval warfare that influenced doctrine development for decades. The United States Navy incorporated merchant interdiction as a primary submarine mission. The Soviet Navy developed similar capabilities during the Cold War. Modern naval planning universally recognizes that control of sea lanes means protecting friendly commerce while interdicting enemy trade, a lesson learned in blood across the Pacific between 1941 and 1945. For Japan, the submarine campaign represented a form of defeat more complete than battlefield losses. The island nation that had built an empire through naval power discovered that naval power meant nothing if the economic foundation collapsed. The factories that produced warships fell silent for lack of raw materials. The pilots who flew from carriers crashed for lack of fuel and training. The soldiers who garrisoned Pacific islands starved for lack of supply ships. Every aspect of Japan's military capability traced back to the merchant marine that sustained it, and that merchant marine had been systematically annihilated by an enemy that understood maritime warfare in ways Japanese doctrine never anticipated. The final irony was that Japan possessed excellent submarines and talented submarine commanders. The I-class submarines were technologically advanced, with long-range, heavy torpedo armament and seaplane capabilities that American submarines lacked. Japanese submarine officers were skilled, aggressive, and courageous, but these assets were squandered on missions that achieved no strategic purpose. Japanese submarines hunted warships that were increasingly difficult to find, while American submarines destroyed the merchant ships that sustained Japan's war effort. Commander Zenji Orita survived the war and spent his remaining years documenting Japan's submarine operations and failures. His comprehensive history, published in 1976, concluded with an assessment that spoke for many Japanese naval officers who'd witnessed the defeat. We possessed the tools for victory but lacked the vision to employ them correctly. We had submarines that could have destroyed American commerce. We used them to hunt carriers. We had destroyers that could have protected our merchants. We used them to screen battleships that never fought. We had the capability to wage effective maritime warfare. We chose to pursue glorious battles instead. The Americans understood that war is not about glory but about logistics, production, and economic strangulation. They fought the war that needed to be fought. We fought the war we imagined. Imagination cannot sink submarines. Doctrine cannot deliver supplies. Pride cannot feed soldiers. We learned these truths too late, and the lesson cost us everything. The merchant sailors who survived Japan's wartime shipping catastrophe carried their trauma silently. Post-war Japan had little interest in stories of defeat, and merchant marine losses lacked the dramatic narrative of battlefield combat. These men had experienced systematic terror convoy after convoy, watching ships sink, watching men die, knowing their own deaths were only delayed by circumstance and luck. Many never spoke of their experiences, carrying their memories in silence until death. The few who did share their stories revealed the lasting psychological impact. Seaman Yoshio Nakamura, who'd survived 3 sinkings, gave testimony to researchers in 1983, 4 decades after the war. His words captured the enduring weight of survival. I am 87 years old now. I have lived a long life. I married, raised children, worked, retired. But I never escaped those convoys. Every night for 40 years I have dreamed of burning ships and drowning men. I smell the fuel oil. I hear the explosions. I feel the water closing over my head. Part of me is still floating in the Pacific, waiting for rescue that may never come. The Americans sank our ships, but they also sank something inside those of us who survived. We came home, but we never left the water. The submarines that accomplished this strategic victory were themselves complex artifacts of American industrial civilization. Each Gato-class submarine required approximately 30,000 man-hours to construct. They were built in shipyards across America: Portsmouth, Mare Island, Gross, Manitowoc. The supply chain that sustained them stretched from iron mines in Minnesota to electronics factories in Ohio to torpedo plants in Virginia. Every submarine represented the mobilization of an entire continental economy, organized with efficiency that Japanese industry never achieved even in peacetime. The submariners who operated these boats came from every American background: farm boys from Iowa, mechanics from Detroit, college students from California, all trained to operate complex machinery in the most hostile environment imaginable. They endured patrols lasting 2 months, lived in cramped conditions with 60 to 80 men sharing spaces designed for comfort, breathed recycled air that often contained dangerous levels of carbon dioxide, and faced enemy action that offered little chance of survival if their boat was destroyed. The casualty rate, they accepted 22% killed, was sustained across 4 years of war. These were volunteers, men who chose submarine duty, knowing the odds. Their motivation wasn't glory or honor in the traditional sense, but something more prosaic and perhaps more American: the conviction that their work mattered, that every merchant ship they sank contributed to ending the war, that logistics and persistence would achieve victory that dramatic battles could not. Admiral Charles Lockwood, who commanded American submarine operations in the Pacific for most of the war, understood what his submariners accomplished. In his post-war memoir, he wrote a passage that stands as perhaps the finest tribute to the submarine campaign. The men who took submarines into Japanese waters fought a war of patience and persistence. They did not seek glorious engagements or dramatic victories. They hunted merchant ships with the systematic determination of men who understood that modern war is won through economic destruction, not battlefield heroics. They achieved strategic victory through tactical excellence executed daily across thousands of miles of ocean. History may remember the carrier battles and the island assaults, but historians will recognize that Japan was defeated by submarines that destroyed the merchant fleet sustaining their empire. Those submariners won the war that mattered most, and they did it in silence beneath the waves where no cameras recorded their actions and no crowds cheered their victories. The statistical record supports Lockwood's assessment. Of the 5,300,000 tons of Japanese merchant shipping sunk during the war, submarines accounted for 55%. Naval aircraft accounted for 30%. Mines, surface action, and other causes split the remaining 15%. But the raw percentages understate submarine impact because they don't capture the cascading effects of merchant losses. Every ton of oil that didn't reach Japan meant aircraft that couldn't fly, ships that couldn't sail, factories that couldn't operate. Every ton of food that didn't arrive meant workers who weakened, soldiers who starved, civilians who suffered. The submarine campaign didn't just sink ships, it severed the arteries that sustained Japan's capacity to wage war. The transformation of amphibious warfare through vehicles like the DUKW, the annihilation of Japanese air power through attacks like Robert Stout's raid on Peleliu, these were tactical victories that shaped individual battles. But the submarine campaign against Japanese merchant shipping was strategic victory, the systematic destruction of an enemy's ability to sustain military operations. It was patient, unglamorous work that received little public attention during the war and remained overshadowed by more dramatic campaigns in popular memory afterward. Yet no aspect of the Pacific War more clearly demonstrated the industrial and doctrinal advantages that ensured American victory. Japan entered the war with inadequate merchant tonnage, insufficient shipbuilding capacity, and naval doctrine that treated commerce protection as secondary. The United States entered with vast industrial resources, established submarine warfare doctrine targeting merchant shipping, and the organizational capability to execute that doctrine systematically across 4 years of global war. The outcome was inevitable once both sides committed to their respective doctrines. Japanese merchant ships continued sailing because Japan's economy required the raw materials they carried. American submarines continued hunting because their doctrine prioritized merchant interdiction. The mathematics of attrition favored the side with more submarines, better technology, and strategic clarity. Japan could replace neither ships nor doctrine fast enough to avoid defeat. America could produce submarines faster than Japan could sink them and execute strategy that systematically achieved the objective of economic strangulation. By August 1945, when Japan surrendered, the merchant fleet that had once connected an empire stretching from Burma to the Marshall Islands had been reduced to coastal scows and fishing boats. The great cargo vessels that had carried the resources of Southeast Asia to Japanese factories lay scattered across the Pacific seafloor, metal tombs for the 60,000 merchant sailors who died serving an empire that couldn't protect them. The submarine campaign had accomplished exactly what War Plan Orange had envisioned 20 years earlier: the complete economic isolation of Japan through systematic destruction of maritime commerce. The decisive battle that Japanese naval doctrine had anticipated never occurred because submarines had already won the war that mattered not through glorious engagement, but through patient, persistent, economically focused campaign that starved an island empire into submission. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, had famously warned his superiors before the war that Japan could not win a prolonged conflict with the United States. His prediction was vindicated not through carrier battles or island campaigns, but through the methodical work of submarine crews who destroyed Japanese merchant shipping one convoy at a time. The submarines didn't defeat Japan in a moment of dramatic victory. They defeated Japan by removing, ship by ship and ton by ton, the economic foundation that sustained Japan's capacity to fight. In the end, the Japanese had never expected submarine doctrine to sink 55% of their merchant fleet in 4 years because their doctrine said it couldn't happen. Submarines attacked warships. Merchant protection was secondary. The decisive battle would determine the war's outcome. These beliefs, held with absolute conviction by an entire generation of Japanese naval officers, collided with an American campaign that ignored Japanese expectations and executed strategy based on economic reality rather than cultural preference. The collision was no contest. Japanese expectations meant nothing against American torpedoes. Japanese doctrine couldn't protect ships from submarines that American industry produced in overwhelming numbers. Japanese pride couldn't transport oil from the East Indies when tankers lay on the ocean floor. The war was decided not by the battles both sides wanted to fight, but by the campaign one side executed and the other side never developed adequate defenses against. The merchant sailors who died in that campaign left no monuments, received few honors, and disappeared into statistical categories in official histories. But their deaths represented the true cost of Japan's strategic failure. Not warriors falling in battle, but working men drowning in the dark because their navy had priorities that didn't include protecting the ships they sailed on. That was the deepest failure of Japanese naval doctrine, not that it lost battles, but that it abandoned the men whose labor sustained the empire, leaving them to die in waters where submarines hunted unopposed and rescue rarely came. The submarines that hunted those waters have their own legacy. Some survive as museum ships, preserved to show future generations what American submariners accomplished. Most were scrapped in the post-war years, their metal recycled for peaceful purposes. But their impact endures in naval doctrine, in strategic planning, in the understanding that modern war is fundamentally economic, and that control of the sea means protecting commerce as much as winning battles. The Japanese never expected submarines to matter so much. That was their fatal mistake, not underestimating American fighting spirit or industrial capacity, but misunderstanding what submarines could accomplish when employed systematically against maritime commerce. They built a navy to fight the war they imagined. The Americans built a navy to fight the war that economic analysis said was necessary. Imagination lost to mathematics, and 1,214 sunken merchant ships marked the equation's solution. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.